There are times in history that fracture reality. Events so violent, so sudden, so psychologically destabilizing that a nation doesn't simply grieve. It rewrites its sense of truth. November 22nd, 1963 was not just the assassination of a president. It was the assassination of certainty. A moment where the American public watched power fall, blood spill, and silence replace stability. And in that silence, something far more enduring was born. Suspicion, fear, and a hunger for meaning that no official explanation could satisfy. As Cold War secrecy expanded, government agencies operated in the shadows. Files disappeared, surveillance grew, and revelations arrived in fragments. To the public, these fragmented truths didn't appear as complexity. They appeared as coordination, a master hand, a hidden architecture of control. What looked like coincidence began to feel orchestrated. What was disconnected began to feel intentional. And a cultural phenomenon emerged that would redefine American psychology for generations. Conspiracy culture was no longer fringe. It became identity. It became collective memory. It became a parallel version of history. But what if the connections people see were never connections at all? What if the illusion of a unified plot wasn't evidence of deeper power, but evidence of something far more human? A mind desperate to turn chaos into design. Tonight, we don't chase conspiracies. We examine their birth. We enter the psychological and historical fault line where Cold War secrecy, trauma, and human cognition collide. To understand why the JFK assassination became the epicenter of American conspiracy culture, we must first dismantle how the illusion was built. The early 1960s were not quiet years. They were years of invisible war. The Cold War was not simply fought with missiles and diplomacy, but with clandestine memorandums, wiretaps, psychological warfare, and covert destabilization. Within this volatile landscape, multiple government programs ran simultaneously, not as a unified machine, but as compartmentalized entities driven by fear of communism, civil unrest, and geopolitical uncertainty. The FBI was conducting COINTELPRO, a domestic surveillance initiative targeting organizations perceived as subversive. Civil rights leaders were monitored, harassed, and psychologically destabilized. Martin Luther King Jr. became a central target of this program, with surveillance intensifying mere weeks before the Kennedy assassination. At the same time, the CIA was executing foreign operations intended to destabilize Fidel Castro's Cuban regime. These included assassination plots so reckless and improvised that they bordered on surreal. Poisoned cigars, contaminated wetsuits, explosive seashells. A shadow war detached entirely from domestic counterintelligence. And then, in the middle of this operational noise, the president is killed. The public becomes aware not immediately, but years later, that government agencies were secretly orchestrating violent schemes, lying to investigators, withholding information from official inquiries, and operating programs that contradicted democratic transparency. To the mind of the average American, the narrative was simple. If these programs were secret, what else was? The problem was never that secrecy existed. The problem was that with each revelation came a pattern. In 1975, the Church Committee revealed that the CIA had plotted the assassination of foreign leaders. The same decade revealed COINTELPRO had systematically sabotaged civil rights movements and political dissent. The Warren Commission's investigation into JFK was exposed as flawed, compromised, and incomplete. These revelations were not synchronized operations. They were uncovered simultaneously. And that timing crafted an illusion. A retroactive sense of cohesion began to form in the public consciousness. If the same agencies were responsible for covert plots, surveillance, and dishonesty, then surely the assassination of a president must have been a part of that machine. But psychology paints a different picture. Human cognition is not built to tolerate randomness and tragedy. We seek proportionality. A monumental event must have a monumental cause. The idea that a disillusioned individual acted alone felt emotionally insufficient against the magnitude of national trauma. And so, the mind filled the void. A conspiracy became more comforting than chaos. This psychological process has a name: illusory pattern recognition. When presented with fragmented data, the brain instinctively connects dots, even when those dots do not actually correlate. Temporal proximity becomes perceived coordination. Coincidence becomes casualty. Overlap becomes orchestration. This is compounded by the proportionality bias, the belief that significant outcomes require significant causes. A president dying cannot simply be an act of lone instability. The mind insists. It must be strategic, controlled, engineered. Once the narrative begins, confirmation becomes automatic. New evidence is no longer evaluated neutrally. It is filtered to support the existing belief. Contradictions are interpreted as cover-ups. Denials become proof. Absence of evidence becomes evidence itself. And therein lies the defining architecture of conspiracy culture. Not a search for truth, but the construction of certainty. This does not absolve institutions of misconduct. The CIA withheld information. The FBI abused power. The Warren Commission failed to provide transparency. These were real failures. They were legitimate grounds for skepticism, but skepticism became something else. The leap from questioning to certainty occurred not because of new evidence, but because the mind could not tolerate ambiguity. As new assassinations followed, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, the narrative hardened. A conspiracy web expanded, folding into intelligence agencies, organized crime, foreign governments, and political elites in a singular monolithic antagonist. Yet, investigation after investigation failed to find structural unity. What existed instead were disorganized bureaucracies, reckless planning, moral failures, and institutional self-protection. Corruption? Yes. Coordination? No. But the belief had already reshaped the cultural identity of America, and the public's distrust didn't emerge from fantasy. It emerged from precedent, because while some assassinations remained shrouded in ambiguity, others were not ambiguous at all. In 1969, the FBI and Chicago Police Department orchestrated the killing of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. A coordinated raid built on an informant's floor plan, a drugged body, 90 rounds of police gunfire, and an official narrative that later was proven false. COINTELPRO documents confirmed that Hampton was deliberately targeted, monitored, and neutralized. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't theory. This was a government conspiracy, documented, admitted, undeniable. So when Americans looked back at JFK, MLK Jr., and Robert Kennedy, they weren't imagining patterns in a vacuum. They were pattern matching against something real. The psychological soil was already prepared. If the government could conspire to eliminate one political leader, the mind asked, why not others? And in that environment, ambiguity became evidence. Coincidence became coordination. And distrust became the default lens through which national tragedy was interpreted. JFK did not produce conspiracy culture alone. He crystallized it. His assassination arrived at a psychological crossroads, the end of a post-war innocence, televised trauma, mass media saturation, rapid cultural change, civil rights unrest, and the Vietnam escalation. The nation was already unsteady. His death became the emotional epicenter of a much larger collapse of trust. The government no longer appeared as guardian. It appeared as suspect. Suspicion infected everything. Truth became subjective, and conspiracy stopped being fringe. It became an alternate epistemology, a parallel reality built on distrust, skepticism, repurposed as ideology, and emotion masquerading as investigation. There is a temptation to believe that knowledge frees us, that exposure reveals clarity. But sometimes, revelation merely deepens the shadow. The tragedy of conspiracy culture is not that people ask questions. It is that they stop listening to the answers once those answers no longer satisfy emotional needs. The JFK assassination did not just kill a president. It altered how a nation understands truth itself. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the architecture of modern conspiracy isn't built by secrecy alone. It's built by the human psyche trying to make meaning from chaos. And once a mind decides the world is controlled, every silence becomes proof. Every contradiction becomes confirmation. Every absence becomes intention. Not because a master plan exists, but because the mind refuses to believe that randomness could ever be so cruel. And in that space, between uncertainty and meaning, conspiracy becomes comfort. A story we tell not because it's true, but because it feels safer than admitting the world is fragile. And that fragility is the most terrifying truth of all. Take care.